Just before midnight, on a dark country lane in Worcestershire, a police sergeant slams on the brakes of his patrol car. He already knows the man walking towards him in the headlights. There is blood on his clothes. He doesn't run. He doesn't say a word in his defense. Less than an hour earlier, inside a large house near a quiet market town, 2 children were found alone in the back garden, unaware that their mother was lying in the road at the front of the house. She would not survive the night. The man in the headlights is not a stranger to violence. 16 years earlier, on a different continent, he had already shot someone in broad daylight, outside a hospital, in front of witnesses, and walked away from it. This is the case of Harold Landry and Lucy Landry. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to the case. Lucy Landry, born Lucy Davies, grew up in South Wales, a former pupil of Craigiehesk Primary School and Coedulan Comprehensive in Pontypridd. Those who knew her as a girl and later as a young woman described her the same way again and again: bright, bubbly, beautiful. Not in the vague, obligatory way people describe the dead, but with real specificity. The sort of person friends remember laughing with, rather than simply remember. By her 20s, she had a young son and was studying music in Coventry when her life took an unusual turn. She met an American oil executive online, more than 20 years her senior, and by the time she was 28, she was pregnant, married, and living in a different country entirely. For a while, by most accounts, it worked. Friends of her husband who met her in the early years remembered a woman who seemed to genuinely enjoy her new life, who liked nice things and wasn't shy about it, who doted on her young daughter and clearly adored being a mother. She had, in the words of one family friend, a rare quality. What you saw with Lucy really was what you got. But the woman who died on a country road outside Pershore in February 2010 was, by then, someone very different from the 28-year-old who had crossed an ocean for love, or something like it. Years into a marriage that had curdled into arguments and drinking, she had become, in the description given later at trial, something close to a recluse in her own home. She had found someone else. She wanted out. And whatever she believed she was walking towards, it was not what actually happened to her that night. She left behind 2 children, 7 and 14, who were in the house when it happened, and who were found by police in the back garden, unaware their mother was already gone. There's a detail from Lucy's early years with Landry that friends of his still bring up, almost as a kind of foreshadowing they only recognized in hindsight. On a family holiday to Mexico not long after the wedding, Lucy brought along her young son and, oddly, the boy's father, her old boyfriend, all staying together in the same place, all paid for by her new husband. At the time, people around them just found it strange. Looking back, some of them have said it was the first sign that Lucy's loyalties, even early on, weren't as settled as Landry believed them to be. Harold Landry, known to friends simply as H, was born into a large family on the Louisiana Bayou, one of a dozen brothers and sisters growing up in a small town called Berwick. He didn't stay poor. Through the American oil industry, designing cranes for offshore rigs, he built himself into a genuine millionaire, tough in business, according to those who worked with him, but by his friend's account, softer with his own family than his reputation suggested. By the time he met Lucy online in around 1999, he was on his third attempt at marriage, twice divorced already, in his early 50s, wealthy, and by his own friend's description, lonely. Lucy was in her 20s. The age gap alarmed some of the people close to him from the start. But Landry, according to those who knew him, doted on her completely, showered her with the kind of attention and expense that some friends found genuinely touching and others found faintly uncomfortable to watch. What almost nobody around Landry mentioned to the people he met in England was what had happened back home in 1994. He had shot a man named Chris Price in broad daylight, outside a hospital, in front of witnesses, the husband of a woman he had been seeing at the time. He was tried for attempted murder. He was convicted instead of a lesser charge, aggravated battery, and ultimately walked away with probation, a fine, and community service. His own lawyer at the time did not think much of his chances on the stand. Landry, it turned out, had a habit of surviving situations that should have ended his freedom. None of that history followed him to Worcestershire, to his new English neighbours, in a village known for its quiet, well-to-do residents, and an old abbey whose bells still mark the hours. Harold Landry was simply the wealthy American who had married a local girl and settled into the role of country gentleman, learning, a little clumsily, to call the lift a lift instead of an elevator. The marriage held together for about 7 years before it began to come apart, and when it did, it came apart loudly. Friends who visited the house in the months before Lucy's death remembered evenings that started normally enough and ended in shouting, arguments that seemed to arrive with the drink and worsen as the night wore on. In 2009, Lucy reconnected on Facebook with a man from her school years in Wales, Gareth Jenkins. What began online became an affair, and Lucy did not try particularly hard to hide it. She told her husband fairly quickly, and divorce proceedings followed soon after. For a while, the two of them lived under the same roof in separate bedrooms, a marriage in name only, while the practicalities of ending it played out around them. Landry, by his friend's account, did not take the collapse well. He left for a spell in Mexico, apparently hoping some distance might cool things down. Instead, while he was away, Lucy moved her new boyfriend into the family home, the same large house Landry had bought for her. When he came back, whatever hope he'd been holding on to seemed to curdle into something harder. What followed was less a heartbreak story and more a financial siege. The two of them argued over and over about the terms of the split, the house, the cars, who would keep what Lucy and the children would be left with once the marriage was formally over. Landry gave Lucy money for a rental apartment as a gesture of goodwill during the separation. According to people close to him, she used that money instead to hire the sharpest divorce lawyer she could find, and the fight over money only sharpened from there. By the final week of January 2010, the two of them were, by every account, locked in exactly the kind of bitter, circling argument that had defined the previous 6 months. A friend who'd visited only a few months earlier remembered evenings where the drinking started early and the shouting followed close behind, the two of them going round and round the same handful of grievances until whoever was watching just wanted to leave the room. Neither one of them, it seems, had any idea how close it was to ending. On the evening of 1 February 2010, less than an hour before the attack, Lucy posted a message on Facebook, saying she had never hated anyone the way she hated someone now. She meant her husband. The row that night started, according to Landry's own account, over furniture Lucy wanted to take with her when she moved out. It didn't stay small. At some point, the argument moved into Lucy's bedroom, where the two of them ended up wrestling over her mobile phone, which held her private messages. From there, it moved downstairs, into the kitchen, with their children somewhere else in the house. Landry told police, and later a jury, that Lucy shoved him, that he caught himself against a baker's rack, and that as he pulled himself back up, his hand landed on the nearest object, a granite rolling pin sitting on the counter. He picked it up and struck her in the head with it. She screamed, grabbed at her head, and ran. She ran out of the house and into the dark, heading in the direction of a neighbor's home, trying, it seems, to reach somewhere safe. Landry went after her. By the time it was over, he had stabbed her more than 20 times. A neighbor who heard her screaming ran outside to help, but there was nothing left to do. Lucy collapsed and died in the road outside the house. Landry did not stay at the scene. He drove instead to the home of the woman he had recently started seeing, told her that something terrible had happened, and handed her 3 banker's drafts worth £30,000 between them, along with cash, his car keys, and a set of signed blank checks. He then set off walking, on foot, back in the direction of his own house. He didn't get far. Just before midnight, a police sergeant patrolling the country lanes spotted him and recognized him immediately. Landry was arrested on the spot. He offered no resistance and, by the arresting officer's account, showed nothing in his manner to suggest what he had just done. He did not deny it. He told police plainly that he had killed his wife. The first officers to reach the house found the scene soaked in blood, Lucy still with a large kitchen knife in her body. Their first priority, before anything else, was finding the children. They were located safe in the back garden, 7 and 14 years old, with no idea that their mother was lying at the front of the house. One of the first officers on scene would later describe it as unlike anything he'd attended before, paramedics already working on Lucy by the time he arrived, a large wound to her cheek, visible even in the dark. It's a small procedural detail, but it's the kind of thing that tends to stay with the people whose job it is to walk into scenes like this one, long after the case itself is closed. Unlike a lot of cases where investigators have to reconstruct events from fragments, this one came with something rarer, a confession, offered freely, within the hour. Landry told the arresting officer what he had done almost immediately, and later gave police a detailed account of the fight in the kitchen, the rolling pin, and the chase outside. That account became the backbone of the prosecution case, not because detectives had to dig for evidence of what happened, but because the real battle in court was over how it should be legally understood. The physical evidence still mattered enormously. The scene itself, the blood, the discarded knife still in Lucy's body, the marks in the kitchen, corroborated the sequence Landry had described, lending his own confession a kind of forensic backing. Prosecutors used an animation at trial to walk the jury through the injuries in detail, more than 20 separate knife wounds, a level of violence that spoke for itself far more powerfully than any single witness could. Perhaps the most consequential piece of evidence in this case, though, was one the jury never heard. Ahead of the trial, prosecutors applied to introduce Landry's 1994 shooting of Chris Price in Louisiana, arguing it was relevant to how the jury should weigh his account of being provoked into violence by his wife. The judge sided with the defense and ruled it out. It's a decision worth sitting with, because it meant 12 members of the public were asked to judge whether Harold Landry was a fundamentally non-violent man pushed past his limit, without ever learning he had already shot someone under strikingly similar emotional circumstances, jealousy, a relationship unraveling, a rival he blamed for it. The medical evidence around the injuries themselves, the head wound from the rolling pin, the pattern and number of stab wounds, also worked against the defense's version of a single, desperate reaction. A blow to the head followed by a pursuit outside the house followed by more than 20 stab wounds is not easily explained as one instinctive act of self-protection. It reads, to a jury weighing intent, as a sustained and escalating attack, which is ultimately how this jury chose to read it too. None of what follows is a clinical diagnosis of Harold Landry. It's an attempt to make sense, using only what was said in court and what his own friends and words reveal of the pattern that runs underneath this case. The defense Landry offered at trial was provocation, the claim that his wife's behavior, her affair, her financial demands, her alleged violence towards him, pushed him past the point where he could be held fully responsible for what he did. It's worth noting that provocation as a legal defense doesn't require the other person to be blameless. It requires the jury to believe the response was, in some meaningful sense, proportionate to what triggered it. That is where this defense collapsed. Even his own barrister admitted, in hindsight, that stabbing another human being more than 20 times sits well beyond what most people would recognize as a simple loss of control. What's more striking than the failed defense itself is what it reveals about how Landry saw the entire episode, both at the time and years later. In prison letters to friends, he wrote about Lucy's death in language that, read carelessly, could almost be mistaken for someone else's grief, as though the person who killed her and the person mourning her were somehow different people. In a later television interview, he described his ex-wife as having turned into what he called a gold digger by the end, framing 6 months of divorce negotiations as a sustained campaign of humiliation against him, the justification, in his telling, for what came next. That reframing, cost and grievance replacing memory of a real, complicated marriage, is a pattern worth naming without over-explaining it, a tendency to recast one's own violence as the natural, almost inevitable result of someone else's provocation. Landry didn't deny killing Lucy, not once, not to police, not in court, not years later on camera. What he consistently refused to accept was that it had been murder rather than a response he considered, in some sense, earned. Asked directly what he would do differently with the benefit of hindsight, his answer was that he would have reacted exactly the same way. That is not remorse, it is certainty, and it's worth remembering that a similar certainty, that his actions in 1994 had been justified rather than criminal, had already carried him through one act of violence largely unscathed. Here's the part of this case that tends to divide people most, and it isn't the rolling pin or the 23 stab wounds, it's the decision, made before the jury ever sat down, to keep Harold Landry's history a secret from them. A man who had already shot someone during a jealousy-driven confrontation, and who then argued in court that he wasn't a violent person, was tried by 12 people who had no idea the first part of that sentence was true. English law generally excludes past convictions from a trial unless they meet a fairly narrow test of relevance, and the judge in this case decided the 1994 shooting didn't clear that bar. Reasonable people, including some legal commentators who followed the case, disagreed sharply with that call. If a defendant's entire defense rests on the claim that violence isn't in his character, doesn't the jury have some right to know it already was, once, under almost identical emotional pressure? There's a second layer to this that's harder to resolve with a simple yes or no. Landry's Louisiana case, the shooting outside the hospital, ended not in prison, but in probation, a fine, and community service, despite happening in broad daylight in front of multiple witnesses. Whatever the specifics of that American courtroom, the outcome meant Harold Landry arrived in England in the 2000s with a clean enough record, on paper, to build a new life, marry, become a father again, and settle into a quiet English village, all without that earlier violence following him across the Atlantic in any meaningful way. It's a genuinely uncomfortable question for true crime as a genre to sit with. How many people currently living ordinary, respectable lives carried a first act of serious violence with them into a second country, a second marriage, a second chance nobody around them knew they'd already had? And then there's Landry himself, post-conviction, giving interviews from prison in which he shows no real doubt that he'd do it again. Most true crime cases end with some search for remorse, however imperfect. This one offers almost none, which is, in its own way, the most unsettling piece of evidence in the entire story. Outside the courthouse, after the verdict, Lucy's father was too overwhelmed to speak for himself. A police officer read a short statement on the family's behalf, that they were relieved by the verdict, that the year had been traumatic beyond words, and that their lives would never be the same. It's a brief, understated sentence, and it carries more weight than almost anything said inside the courtroom during 8 days of trial. Lost in the retelling of granite rolling pins and stabbed bodies and prison confessions is the woman this all happened to, someone friends remembered as genuinely bright and funny, a mother who by every account adored her children, a young woman who crossed an ocean at 28 for a life she believed was going to be good. Whatever went wrong between her and Harold Landry in the years that followed, whatever she said to him on the last night of her life, none of it comes close to justifying what he did to her in that kitchen and then outside it, in the dark, on a quiet road near Pershore. Her father, waiting outside a courtroom he could barely bring himself to speak in, put it more simply than any lawyer or judge managed to across 8 days of evidence: their lives would never be the same. If you want to understand how a case like this comes together, the confession, the forensic evidence, the legal argument the jury never even got to hear, that's exactly the kind of breakdown you'll find on this channel every single day. If that's something you're into, hit subscribe, it's free, and it genuinely means a lot. Thank you for watching.